Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on Reduced Tillage in Organic Vegetable Production by Helen Attowe. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension. We're a community of cooperative extension service personnel, researchers, ag professionals, organic certifiers, and practitioners. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and recorded webinars on our website at the link on your screen. A PDF handout of today's webinar slides is also available at the second link on your screen. We're honored to welcome Helen Attowe as our speaker today. Helen has been farming on her own and consulting for other organic vegetable and fruit farms for 25 years. She owned and operated Biodesign Farm, a 30-acre, diverse organic fruit and vegetable farm in western Montana for 17 years, and recently spent 6 months as a consulting vegetable grower on a 2,000-acre organic vegetable and fruit farm in northern Colorado with a 5,000-member CSA. Helen also worked as a horticulture extension agent in Montana for 15 years. Helen will be speaking for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, you can simply type it into the question box on your screen and hit return. If you don't see the question box, click the small plus sign next to the word question on your control panel to open it up. We'll be reading the questions out loud, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. So now, Helen, I'm going to hand over the screen controls to you.
I welcome everybody. It's exciting to be able let's go back. It's exciting to be able to talk to everyone about this thing that I've been thinking about for many, many years, and I know a lot of other people have been as well. In fact, the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot of interest and a lot of research in organic no-till, and so what do we mean by that? And how do we get there? And what do we use as our models? And of course, I've always spent my time looking at natural systems, and of course, again, the devil is in the details of how to do it for everybody, and I'm going to take you through my journey and the devils that I've had to deal with in terms of detail. So what we're trying to do basically is increase plant diversity, reduce tillage, and then all the other things that come up, which I call managing ecological interrelationships. That's the part that is really the most intriguing. And I could spend a lot of time on why reduce tillage, but there are people who've done that much better than I and have lots and lots of data. So I'm going to just say that reduce tillage is what we are trying to do to minimize soil disturbance and then make sure that we have the most healthy soil microbial community and activate all of those rhizosphere interactions that we'd like to encourage. So I'm going to take you on my journey, which I'd love to say was entirely planned and, of course, wasn't in the least. So the first time I quit college, I managed to find this wonderful place in Georgia, and they were doing natural farming, which was inspired by Masanobu Fukuoka, and the little Japanese man that was running the place in Georgia taught me all these wonderful things that I had never seen before growing up on a conventional ranch and grain production in Montana. So I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but we won't. I'll just say that this was my first glimpse of seeing soil covered all year round and what that really meant, and that you could actually get away with that. And I'll have to say we did much better with the grains having soil covered all year round than we did with the vegetables being covered all year round. And that got me excited enough to go back to college and graduate school, and I ended up at Rutgers University and got to work with an incredible farm. At that time, in 1986, it was one of the largest organic vegetable and fruit production farms in New Jersey. And of course, now I was scared and wanted to have soil covered, but also wanted to have really good yields. There was a lot of money riding on this farm. So we didn't go as far, but we did want to do something to encourage beneficial insects, and then there was some interesting research that indicated that if we had the soil covered, we would have less disease problems because less splashing of pathogens onto the fruit. So what we did was go with that straw that you see in the picture with the staked tomatoes, and of course, as you can imagine, that was extremely expensive. So that when I got on my own finally and had a 25-acre organic vegetable production that was basically leased land, it was a nonprofit organization. I was 30 and thought I knew everything, so I thought I would put in this huge amount of staked tomatoes, and darned if I couldn't figure out, I'm not very good with equipment, and I couldn't figure out how to get in between those rows and till and make them look like the rows of the farm I had worked on previously. But fortunately, I remembered that Masanobu Fukuoka experience, and so I let the weeds grow, and we mowed the weeds, and we said, oh my goodness, look at this. This actually works. And we thought, wow, we don't have to lay down straw. What more could we do? So finally I got back to Montana, and I had my own farm, and we could do whatever we wanted on this place because it was all on our shoulders. And one of the big problems, or one of the challenges that I had working with my own operation and with other people that I had tried to help, is that in organic production we seem to have difficulties getting nitrogen, and especially early nitrogen, so that we could get crops off early and get good yields early. So I became the legume queen and went almost entirely to legume living mulches, which actually is what I learned from Masanobu Fukuoka. So in the 8 or 10 years that we played with living mulches to begin with, before we really got the system ironed out, so to speak, we went through a lot of different kinds of legumes. And here's a picture, a wide drive row of Parabinga medic, which is an annual legume and much easier to control. Later on, as we refined the living mulch reduced tillage system, excuse me, that we worked on for many years, we went with perennial clovers and started looking pretty wild. My neighbors sometimes commented that they couldn't tell where my crops started and where the living mulch ended. So we had the soil covered for most of the year, but not all of the year. In the spring, usually in late May, that spring in Montana, we would go in and do light tillage. But we would make sure that we didn't beat the soil to a pulp, so to speak, and we would leave as much residue as possible. And in fact, I know we left a lot of residue because every spring my neighbors would drive by, and about the time I got the beds to this point when I was ready to plant and make bigger beds, my neighbors would say, when are you going to start farming for the spring? When are you going to get your fields ready? So we definitely left a lot of residue on the field. And then we would go in and reseed the living mulch each spring in the rows between the beds. So we had the beds made, and then in the rows in between, we would seed the living mulch. And in this case, we started to use a lot of white clovers, and all-site clover, mainly because it was cheap seed, became what we used most often until the price of all-site clover went up. What was kind of exciting about the system as we watched is that when we used these perennial clovers, we would till them up, of course, but because we left a lot of residue, we would get recruits from the previous year that would grow right back up. Some people might actually call that weeds. The good news is that that meant that the soil was covered pretty much all the time except for about 3 to 4 weeks. As I got more brave in managing all this residue, which some people could call weeds, we started to leave islands of no-till areas within the system so that it wouldn't take so long for the seed that we put down to then grow up every spring. And so we would kind of leave these areas of untilled clover. And the other thing that happened, I don't necessarily always show my equipment to everyone because I know there's people out there laughing right now, but the good news is that over the years, the soil got such good tilth and so soft that we could use this old Massey Ferguson for the whole time I farmed, and it was older than I when I got it, and it is still being used. And as you can see, we modified some equipment to till in, so to speak, our residue and our clover each spring. This is well, it's a potato cultivator, and those of you who know about equipment can see what I've done to it. So we left some...
Helen, this is Helen. Can I just interrupt for one moment? There are a couple of people that are saying that they're having a little trouble hearing. So I don't know if you can keep your phone a little bit closer to your mouth or something. I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say because I've heard from a few people.
Okay, it's really close to my mouth. How about I try talking louder, and we'll try talk really, really loud if that'll help.
Okay, well, somebody just said it was okay. Okay, so thanks so much. Okay.
I'm talking more loudly now. Usually people tell me to be quiet, so this is kind of interesting. Okay, so we would for that 3 to 4 week period, we would have the soil uncovered, but usually by early June, the soil would be covered. About the time we were just starting to pick broccoli and we were transplanting our warm season crop, you can see pepper transplants growing nicely in our black plastic mulch, which we did utilize to warm the soil in Montana, and which I will be doing penance for now for the rest of my farming career, or the rest of my what I'm doing now career. I always would tell students that I'm going to environmental hell for using plastic. On the other hand, until later in the operation, we didn't figure out any real alternatives to clover. So, to black plastic mulch. We never did figure alternatives to clover. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more. But here you can see that this was the early stages when we did the living mulches between rows, and we reseeded every spring. And it got pretty wild looking by summertime, and there was actually quite a bit of residue, and we wanted to learn how to manage that residue because, again, that was the devil detail that we wanted to know more and more about. So in 1995 and 1996, we got a SARE grant to look at methods for managing that clover that we had planted in between the rows. This was not in the row, but in between the rows. And what we decided to do is to compare mowing the residue and light tillage at different times of the year to see if that made a difference, fall, summer, or spring. And then our control, of course, was what is conventionally done. I call it conventional organic, and that is tillage in between the rows, usually smaller rows than this, though, of course. So we put this experiment together, and what we found was that tillage decreased soil organic matter, earthworms, and total microbial biomass. And, of course, this wasn't much of a surprise. This was mostly exactly what we had seen in the literature, but it was neat to go through the 2 years of study and figure it out on our own operation. What we did find out is that all of those, soil organic matter, earthworms, and total microbial biomass, or total microbes, fungi, and bacteria, were increased with regular additions of fresh organic residue, which in our case was clover mowed monthly. I want to point out two interesting things with my sort of weird slides. Remember, this was true in-the-field farmer research. And one is the incredible variation in total microbial biomass throughout the season. So getting statistical significance was interesting here. And in Montana, we always started with low total microbial biomass, and we ended with low total microbial biomass. So there was a lot of temperature dependence there. With the earthworms, the treatment that's so low on the far right of the bottom graph, that's the bare soil. And clearly that was significant and different from all the other treatments. The only other one that was really significant was the mowed treatment early in the spring, and the residue left on and lots of time to decompose. One of those bars that looks all about the same was the other control, and that was living mulch without any mowing at all. And that was kind of an intriguing thing. So if you just leave the residue there, or the plants there growing, we didn't see as much increase in total microbial biomass or earthworms. So we came to the conclusion that we do want to manage things a little bit. And in fact, from 1995 to 2004, after that SARE grant, we decided that where we were going to go was this living mulch reduced tillage system where we mowed regularly. And over those years, I guess 9 years, we did tweak the system, but we basically kept that regular mowing piece, and that became what we did until our next big change. So we did things like leaving the broccoli after cutting the heads and cutting the sprouts. We would let that flower and stay in the field, and instead of getting rid of it or mowing it down, we left it as a pollen and nectar source for beneficial insects. And we found that not only beneficial insects, but also birds moved in, which was kind of exciting to see. We just started seeing more and more of those interrelationships to manage. So the results of this 9 years of using this system is that we had incredible yield and really good quality. I have to say that it was a fun 9 years at Farmers Market because we got lots of compliments, and our egos got really, really big. As big as our tomatoes, I think. And the other thing is that we didn't have to market. Marketing became a moot point because the quality was so good that we could play with our experiments and not have to spend a lot of time moving our product. So that was kind of neat. The other thing that we noticed that was kind of a surprise is that we seem to have interesting nutritional changes both in the soil and in the plant tissue, and we saw improved cold tolerance. So these are red peppers that are being picked after temperatures that were in the low to mid-20s, which happens in Montana. And the other thing that we saw was increased habitat for beneficial insects. So remember I said we got brave and we left those islands of clover that then immediately started to grow in the spring, and in the case of this particular living mulch, yellow sweet clover, then bloomed. And so we had habitat early in the spring for particularly parasitic wasps and some of our predators, and they would move in earlier than they had when we just did the living mulch and planted it every spring. The other neat little thing we found is that we got wind protection in the spring for our transplants because we had this taller stuff, this windbreak growing in the field. So we, of course, did quite a bit of measurement, mainly because I like to count things, and I'm a natural history nerd, and I had training in integrated pest management. So we took all kinds of measurements of insects, but I could throw up data, but I think this slide really shows it the best. This is just one pepper leaf out in the middle of the field, and just on this one pepper leaf you can see that we have a wasp parasitized aphid, we have a predator fly larva, we have aphids that are being munched. So we basically got to the point where we had minimal insect pest problems and didn't really have to spray. we found, remember I mentioned that we left the broccoli to go to flower. We also let it seed, and we had birds moving in and living in the broccoli, which was kind of fun. So I started planting the later season brassicas next to the early season broccoli, and we did get birds actually taken out some of the imported cabbage worms that had been a problem, and all the Lepidopterus, all the worms that are from butterflies and moths actually got to be no problem, and we stopped spraying, which is not to say that we didn't have those insect pests. In fact, we, of course, counted because that's what we do. And we found, for example, in 2004, that at the peak of our Cabbage White flight, we still had lots of butterflies out there. In fact, sometimes you could get in the middle of a lot of them flying around and be beat to death with their wings. But if you look really closely at that cabbage, you'll see some holes in the leaves, but not anything in the main cabbage heads, and we never had any complaints from our wholesalers or from farmers market, and we basically stopped spraying BT. So that was kind of a neat thing to find out about our system, and we wanted to understand that a little better. We also began to find greater incidence of things that were overwintering, like spiders and ground beetles, because we left that living mulch. As you can see, all throughout the winter, it would die back, but it was still there. And that was nice because then we had the ground beetles and spiders early in the season. The other really cool thing that we found is that new predators moved in. So it really was a case of create habitat and they will come. So another pest that we sprayed for, which was Colorado potato beetle, started getting taken out by this new predaceous stink bug that we started finding. Probably was always there, but we started finding lots and lots of numbers of them. And again, we basically stopped spraying for Colorado potato beetle on eggplant. Another study that we did is looking at what happened when we covered tomatoes in our system, because we had noticed that we were getting this lovely increased fruit set, and we wanted to know if it had to do with pollinators, even though tomatoes, of course, are facultative selfers. You don't think of them as being a crop that needs lots and lots of pollination. When we put covers over our tomato plants, we did have a decreased fruit set, so we were getting some kind of increase due to pollinators, which was kind of fun to see, because we'd like to see the pollinators. We are butterfly nerds. And in general, our conclusion was that the living mulch plus the broccoli residue created habitat not only for insects and birds, but also for garter snakes, and here's where more of the interrelationships come in. We also learned about voles. There's a cute little vole looking at us right now. And the voles we probably could have done without. We have not at this date yet figured out the beneficial interrelationship of voles in the system yet. They actually began to be somewhat problematic, and I did lose my temper with voles when I would have these 1-pound red peppers and they would go down the line and take holes out of the bottom of all of them. So that was an issue with creating the habitat. We had some guys move in that we didn't know what to do with. The other thing that we found is that we had improved habitat for our soil microbial beneficials, and in fact, we were able to see that there might be a direct effect of increasing our antagonistic microbial population that would eat the bad guy pathogen, so to speak. We we think, and of course we weren't able to really measure this, but we think that we saw disease suppression. So in about 2003 and 2004, we started seeing a little bit of cucumber mosaic virus on our peppers. You can see the spot right there on the pepper leaf. We saw a little on the fruit, but basically it never got out of control. And of course I was very worried when I first saw it. But our yield did not change, and the quality didn't change. So we, for a few years, had this population within our field, but it never got out of control. That was exciting, and another interrelationship that we wanted to figure out. Long-term soil health also really improved with Living Mulch, and we were really nerdy about taking soil samples. Some years we only took a few, and other years we did research projects and we took lots and lots of soil samples. But we have this long-term data over, oh my goodness, over about 17 years. And what we found was that we saw an increase in soil organic matter even though we were taking off really high yields. At one point in the late 90s, when we were measuring our yields, we were picking about 50,000 pounds of tomatoes per acre, but still we saw increases in soil organic matter. We also saw huge increases in total microbial biomass, basically doubling, and we saw increases in nutrient levels. And I don't know if you're looking closely at this table or not, or if anybody even wants to look, but look at the nitrogen levels. The nitrogen levels got so high that we basically stopped adding composted manure towards the end of the 90s, and we began to make other compost, and we began to just go with the living mulches. And by 2003, we weren't adding any manure, and our nitrogen levels did go down, but to a level that was quite acceptable. So that was quite interesting to us to see what a plant-based nutrient system could supply. And in fact, that's my real interest now, and I'm going back to look at some data from 1996 that we took, and after working with other farmers now, I'm asking the question of myself and of these other farms, and going back and looking at this data, and hopefully going through and tweaking some of our own soils data for the last 17 years, because I think it's really interesting to find out whether we really want to think about cover crop biomass or regular additions of quality residue. So what you're looking at now is some research that we did just measuring the nutrient content every time we clipped clover when we did our 1995-1996 study, and we found that the clover had different quality or different nutrients at different times of the year and different growth stages. Well, this, obviously is not rocket science, but it seems to me that we could utilize this in the timing of our crop systems, the timing of our nutrient systems, as we tweak all of the interrelationships. So this is something that I don't really, I'd love to have other people do lots of research on and figure out for me. And so hopefully we have some researchers out there that'll think about that, and I won't have to do any more. Because in 2004, we decided we needed to do more experiments, and being egged on by students who said, well, that's all really cool, Helen, you've reduced tillage, but can't you do more? Can't you have more plant diversity, and can't you reduce tillage even more than you are? So we had 6 acres that we hadn't brought into production. It had been a pasture for 50 years, and we decided, well, okay, let's see if we can do more. Let's do some experiments. So in the fall of 2004, we did what we call sheep tillage. We brought 600 sheep onto 6 acres for about a month. Don't try this at home. It was pretty amazing what those wonderful guys, these were my neighbor's sheep, did. We did have to feed them hay to get them to stay because they really went through that system. And they got it down to much reduced tillage, and of course they left their manure. And then in April 2005, we went through and did our minimum tillage again, left a lot of residue. And because we were setting this up as kind of a long-term experiment, and because we were really interested in those no-till strips, or what now other people were calling beetle banks, we left a 600-foot by 30-foot grassy, untilled pasture. So pasture that had been there for 50 years, we just left undisturbed in the middle of that 6-acre tilled area. And we found, of course, because we started doing soil tests early on, we found that within about 2 weeks, it was amazing, we saw soil organic matter levels drop and nitrate nitrogen levels increase. And of course, this isn't going to surprise anybody. This is why we till. What was kind of interesting to me is the way the tillage homogenized the soil. I'd always been used to having, doing lots of soil tests and having lots of variation within the soil tests. Where we tilled immediately, we kind of homogenized, and we had results that were closer to one another, excuse me, in the replicates where we did the tillage, which was kind of interesting. It got me thinking about how we homogenize our system with tillage. So then we went in and seeded a cover crop, and I love this. It took me, all these years to figure out. Instead of just going straight up the field once, we did a 3-pass system where we went up and down, we went across, and we went on a diagonal. So we got a seed, by golly, everywhere in that field. And when the cover crop germinated, we got this beautiful field, beautiful weed-free field of red clover and triticale, which was so weed-free that it kind of got us excited about what our opportunities might be. So by October of 2005, it was mainly red clover. It was entirely dominant, and you can kind of see the whole setup here. We've got our 50-year-old pasture running down the middle of the field, or our beetle bank, if you like. We've got pasture running around the perimeter of the field, and you can't really see, but on the right, we have a 600-foot strip just inside the tall fence of Montana native fruiting shrubs and perennials, which is our little hedgerow. So we had kind of a neat system set up here, and we began to ask ourselves questions about how far we could go in keeping the soil covered all year round. How much could we really reduce tillage, since we really looked like we didn't have a lot of weeds, we didn't have a real excuse to do a lot of tillage. Could we just move from this beautiful red clover to trying to have an area that was left in no-till strips, as we had experimented with for 10 to 12 years in the other field. So by spring 2006, we started a new system, and here's what it looks like. Basically, we went through and we put compost down in strips, just where we were going to do some tillage. Then we went in and chisel plowed only where we were going to make our beds, and you can see there's a lot of residue from that red clover. Red clover produces lots and lots of residue, as you will see later on. And then, by the way I did that is I had that wonderful old Massey Ferguson, and I got a single shank chisel and just went up and down with it. And then I had a little rototiller, and I went and rototilled and broke that up a little bit. And then we were able to move into our planting operation. And still being in Montana, we really thought about warming soils up. So we did the tilling. You can still see those little clover plants. We have not killed them. You can see a lot of green in that tilled soil. And we raised the beds also to increase temperatures, and we continued with the warm season crops. We also put down our plastic mulch. And with this no-till row middle, we had incredible clover growth by the time we were transplanting even broccoli, and certainly by the time we were transplanting our warm season crops. So you can see that woman standing in the clover up to her knees. She's really 6 foot, so that's tall clover. No, actually she's about 5'2", but it's still really quite a bit of clover. We were thrilled because the clover then acted as a mini greenhouse shield to all those transplants coming in. It was a nice wind barrier and seemed to make it a little warmer in there. So it was kind of nice to have that the different plant heights within the same field, so to speak. So, of course, because people had been asking me how far we could go, we had left a no-till center, but could we get away with actual no-till within the row? So we got another grant from SARE, actually, funded us twice within a 10-year period. Thank you very much, SARE. And we furthered the questions, and I had a student from the University of Montana who got his master's doing this study and did a just super job. So we flamed the red clover and decided that we would plant right into that. And you can see there on the left kind of the whole system, so to speak, way over on the left side of that left photograph. You can see the no-till, or what did we call it? I'm trying to remember what we call it in our data slides. Untilled, the untilled grass strip, and then we have the plastic mulched warm season crops. Then we have our no-till flamed, and then we have our minimum till for things like broccoli and cabbage that we transplant directly without black plastic mulch. So there it was set up looking so nice and neat, we thought we could get away with anything, no weeds anywhere. And of course, that clover didn't stay nice and neat. It continued to grow profusely. So in the top left, you can see that our no-till Brussels sprouts were looking pretty good after they went in, but the clover is moving in perniciously, so to speak. And as long as they still had the nutrients in their soil ball from transplanting, they looked pretty good. But if you look to the right, you can see the clover is really moved back in, and you can see that the Brussels sprouts transplants are starting to look a little sad. They're getting a little purpley looking. And in fact, the soil was cool and there was lots of competition. However, the Brussels sprouts did eventually green up and look healthy and got tall. And my wonderful students and helpers indulged me and dressed up for our ceremony to mark the ascension of the Brussels sprouts when they finally got to be taller than the red clover in the bottom photograph. And of course, there are much better choices than the very aggressive perennial red clover to try no-till with, and any idiot would have chosen something better, but it's what we had from decisions that we'd made 2 years earlier, and so there you have it. But this experiment would have worked much better with annuals that winter kill, for example, and other people have had better results. But our yield was reduced significantly in this no-till experiment. In fact, it was reduced about 36%. So there you have that experiment. On the other hand, we continued on with the minimum tillage, and the minimum tillage experiments had really, really good yield, and good quality continued on at farmers market, and we still had big lines at farmers market, which of course made our egos very happy and made our pocketbooks happy. So I want to show you a few data slides just because it was kind of interesting data. So we looked at soil organic matter, and in that untilled grass plot, the 50-year-old pasture, and in the no-till plot where we had the reduced yield, we had the best soil organic matter. Eventually, over time, where we tilled in the clover, we increased soil organic matter. But in the short term, this is why we want to figure out how to do no-till. We saw better soil organic matter where we do no-till. Nitrogen, of course, is what we looked at for many, many years because we sent our soils to the same lab and we knew what the numbers meant. There are probably better ways to look at soil health and to figure out what's really making your yield a good yield than looking at nitrate nitrogen. But we had already been doing it for, oh gosh, 12 years the same way, so we kept doing it this way. So we looked at nitrate nitrogen, and boy, you can see that the clover minimum till beds, we just got this incredible nitrogen release. And in fact, when I saw this, I said, wow, why did I bother putting down the manure-based compost? I bet we don't need it because our nitrate nitrogen levels got so high and our yields were so high. We saw some other interesting things that, again, I could probably spend the whole hour talking about, and I haven't really figured out, and I'm hoping that other people have some ideas. But I'll just quickly say that the nitrogen was not available until late in the season in the no-till beds. In July, it got up to a reasonable level, and that's why we did finally see the Brussels sprouts getting some good color and producing a crop. But that early season nitrogen was really low for us. We also, just quickly, will mention some of all the other studies we did. We found that the nitrogen, not surprisingly, was low in the untilled grass and in the unmowed clover and in the mowed clover. And interestingly enough, during a single season, the nitrogen was lower in the mowed versus the unmowed clover, which makes sense when you think about it, but wasn't something that I had realized through all these years of mowing clover. So we also kind of think we figured out why the no-till Brussels sprouts yield was so low. Number one, we had that very aggressive red clover, and number two, the two significant things that we measured was the decrease or the late and low nitrogen levels, and the soil temperatures were much cooler in the no-till plots. So that was at least 1 year in 2006. In 2007, the soil temperatures also were significant in decreasing the yield of the no-till, but the nitrogen levels played with us a little bit. So what we did see in that no-till block is that we had incredible pest management, and in fact, that's what my student was measuring. He was trying to figure out how the system worked, what really was going on, and we saw earlier and increased numbers of predators and parasites, mostly predators, by the way, and we also saw incredible diversity of species of predators. So we basically stopped spraying anything in 2000. We realized from our study that we were getting such good biological control that we didn't need to spray. In 2007, we started looking at what we could do to maybe figure out how to manage that residue in the row a little bit better. We'd done that no-till study, but what could we do to tweak it? And we got grant money from the wonderful Organic Farming Research Foundation, who who also supported us in this crazy questioning that we were doing. And basically, we found the same thing. The yield was lowest in the no-till. And I also played with minimum till, the same minimum till, well, maybe even a little less minimum till than we had done, and minimum till plus adding a paper mulch, and minimum till and spraying vinegar once the clover would regrow later in the season. And then we also compared that to keeping it completely clean, so hoeing and tilling in the row throughout the season. And you can see what happened. The paper and the vinegar were pretty good, and in fact the paper had a better yield than the tillage. But minimum till and no-till, the yields were actually not even statistically different at this point. We had low yields. So that was the first part of our weed study. We also wanted to figure out, since we had this new field, where the weeds came from, because I don't know if any of you have weed problems, but weeds are kind of a big deal for organic farmers. And the farm that I consulted for in Colorado this summer, I realized that weeds are the biggest deal, and I don't know why I wasted my time on insects all those years. I wish I'd spent more time figuring out weed ecology. And sure enough, as we looked at our system and followed it and monitored it, we found that where our weeds came from was the soil disturbance and from our compost source, from our manure source, that these are pots of all the different weeds that we found growing in our field in our manure. Well, we also looked a little more closely at our microbial community, and we had this wonderful expert in Mycorrhizae at the University of Montana. So we had him do some studies, and we found that Mycorrhizae, not surprisingly, were highest in the no-till plots and lower in the tillage plot. What was kind of disappointing is that there was no statistical significance between the plot where we tilled all the time, all season, and the plot where we did minimum tillage. The Mycorrhizae were basically decreased with any tillage at all. We had kind of a funny result. It is statistically significant, and I don't really know what it means, but you can see that the minimum tillage, where we also sprayed vinegar, had lower Mycorrhizae, and we had, of course, been doing all the soil measurements, and there was no decrease in soil pH. So we're not really sure why that is the case. But we were disappointed to see that minimum tillage didn't increase our Mycorrhizae, but it didn't. So to summarize, on 17 years worth of that system, actually 18 years, I sold the farm, and other farmers farmed it in 2011. But of course, part of the selling price was that they get me forever as a consultant, and so I get to keep my hands in that soil, so to speak. So here's what we found, basically, that with our reduced tillage system, we had a slightly lower yield. We had excellent quality, and the thing that I realized until I worked for other farms and did this consulting is how important it was that we reduced labor. When we reduced our weeding costs, we really increased our profitability. So in summary, we basically got down to no or very little off-farm fertilizer, no spraying, and very little weeding. The challenges and the things that were problematic in the system is that it's a really tough sell for seeded crops. After working in Colorado this summer, I have lots of ideas now on how to how to do a better job within reduced tillage living mulch system with seeded crops, because mainly what we did in Colorado was seeded crops. But I have to say that on my farm, we did require quite a bit of weeding in the seeded crops. We also had grasses moving into the living mulch. So let's see, we planted the clover in 2005. There's a photograph at the bottom of 2011, and you can see that those row middles, which seem to get bigger and bigger, I noticed, are mostly grass. And in fact, they are mostly grass. So over time, the clover fades out, and the grasses move back in. And of course, part of that is that we're changing the nutrient dynamics. We did measure not only nitrogen and not only absolute phosphorus, but we monitored the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus. So as the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus changed, we saw a movement away from the legume and towards the grasses. So they moved in. You can see still there's not a lot of annual weeds, but we got grasses. And then, of course, I already mentioned vole damage, and those birds that I thought were so wonderful also came in and started pecking at some of the crops, particularly ripe tomatoes. And also in the fruit system, the birds moved in and thought that was fun. So I had to show pictures from Biodesign Farm 2011. Even though I wasn't farming there, that soil continued on to produce lovely peppers, and they had a very good yield. So that's what I want to say about my farm over 17 years. What I did in 2011 was to move to the big time and try and see if some of the ideas and some of my theories would work on a larger scale. So I got this wonderful opportunity to work with a 2,000-acre, very diverse organic vegetable farm with a 5,000-member CSA and a huge wholesale business. And we tried a couple of little experiments. This one, of course, is an interplanting option, but as you can imagine, living mulches had to come in somewhere, and I did try a plot of clover living mulch with broccoli. Ironically, our quote-unquote experiment block was 10 acres, which was bigger than my entire production in Montana. So what we did here is that these are beds that are a 60-inch bed, and what we did was come through with a 5-row spider seeder and seeded the clover, and then we immediately came in and transplanted the broccoli into 2 rows. This probably is not the way I would have done it, but I worked around, the equipment that we had on the farm. So we left what I had always done, the row middles bare, and we actually planted clover in the beds. So again, different. And it also gave us the cheater, the fallback safety to go in and cultivate the furrows, which we did. You can see below that photograph as the broccoli started to grow and the clover started to grow that we came in and cultivated that furrow. And I have to tell you that I did chicken out a little bit. I did cultivate in between the broccoli rows because that clover was looking very aggressive to me. So here's later in the season. Above, the photograph above, we have the clover living mulch, and you can still see that there are some weeds growing up above the broccoli, particularly lamb's quarters and red root pigweed, which if we could have sold that on this farm, we would be millionaires. It grew very well without any encouragement at all. Below, you can see that the living mulch actually did seem to diminish the weeds somewhat, because below there's no living mulch. It's kind of a control with just cultivation and no hand hoeing. And you can see that it's a lot harder to see broccoli plants there because the the weeds are growing very, very well in that control. So in the end, what we found was, well, we compared a control. Another control was broccoli planted in another field, but exactly at the same time, and that was cultivated and hand-hoed. Significant amount of time, I might add, going into hand-hoeing. And on the right, you can see the clover living mulch and the broccoli as we were getting closer to harvest. And so quite a difference in a visual, and quite a difference in the amount of labor. Obviously, no hoeing labor in that clover living mulch broccoli. So what we found actually is that the yield was okay in the living mulch. It wasn't great, and in fact, the yield was higher in the hoed broccoli, but the quality was good in the living mulch broccoli. In fact, we kind of joked that we wanted, what our wholesalers wanted was, you know, big heads and really, really skinny stems, what I like to call Barbie broccoli. And the broccoli in the living mulch had to grow really, really tall, and by golly, it managed to have real skinny stems as a result. So there is our living mulch experiment in 1 year on a bigger scale. I do need to tell you that I was very surprised after my 17 years of farming to find that we had no biological, or very little, if any, biological control from all that diversity in the field. We actually had to spray for cabbage worms in all those fields at this point, all those broccoli fields. So developing those interrelationships takes time. And in fact, I promised future directions. I don't have time to talk about future directions, but I did put down my website, veganicpermaculture.com. And if you think what I've done is really weird in this presentation, wait till you see what I'm trying to do now. And with that, I'm ready to entertain some comments and questions, and hopefully people out there will have figured all the things I don't know out and be able to tell me things.
Well, thank you very much, Helen, and also for all those wonderful photos. We're about to start our question and answer period, and for anyone who missed the beginning of the presentation, you can use the question box on your screen to type in questions and hit return. If you don't see the question box, you can click the small plus sign next to the word question, and then you can open it up. We'll be reading as many questions as we can out loud for the next half hour or so. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted to the link, which will be on your screen in just a second. Here we go. Within the coming week. You can also use the Ask an Expert system if you like to ask more questions about anything, basically, at extension.org/ask related to organic farming or farming in general. You can find our other upcoming and recorded webinars at the link on your screen. And finally, we really value your feedback, so we'd very much appreciate it if you could fill out our follow-up survey, which will be coming in an email later today. So with that, let's move on to our questions. There were quite a few questions asking for more of the details of Biodesign Farm, your different inputs and other conditions there. So the first one is, how did you manage or compensate for soil moisture loss because of the living mulch? Did you have irrigation available?
Oh, excellent question. I'm sorry I forgot to mention that. In fact, I think I missed a slide there. I'm not sure where it went, but I wanted to talk about those interrelationships. You know what I think happened is that second PowerPoint that I uploaded didn't get in. I wanted to show you a picture of harvesting onions. And some of the interrelationships that were most interesting was how, what was the competition threshold. And there's a photograph of onions going down the row and the clover just totally overtaking it. And then the harvest, the onions are huge, and we had a really good yield. And that wouldn't have happened with transplanted or, God forbid, seeded lettuce. So what we found over time as we looked at all those interrelationships is as long as we kept the soil fertility high and the water high, to answer the question, my water use was profligate. I started out with drip irrigation under the beds, under the where the row was, and I ended up going to overhead sprinkler irrigation because I was very spoiled and had gravity flow a water system that would run my sprinkler irrigation. So I hope there's no water people listening, but I am sure that we overwatered constantly. So where we did not water the clover, by the way, where the plastic mulch was, we just had drip irrigation. The clover over time got quite stressed. Even within a single growing season, the clover diminished a little bit. It still provided relatively good weed control, but some weeds moved in, particularly grasses. But over time, we couldn't continue to do that. The clover could not survive without the water. But I'm so glad you asked that question, because where I want to go next is thinking a lot more about competition thresholds and timing of crops, when you transplant, when you seed, whether to add nutrients, whether you don't need to add nutrients, and how much water, based on the interrelationships with the legume living mulch.
Okay. Another question. We had a listener who was interested in how you incorporated all the quality residue. With only one tillage event per year, are you relying solely on water to incorporate the green residue?
I hadn't thought about that question in just that light. And I didn't show you a lot of the data that I am still trying to figure out based on tillage versus mowing versus when you mow, when you till, not mowing at all, just letting it do its thing. But in the early part of Biodesign Farm, we had one tillage event per year. That sounds kind of funny, tillage event, but that's true. And then remember that, as I just said, we had lots of water, but we incorporated it with, with that equipment you saw. And I guess I'm not sure I'm really answering that question well. The last part of when we changed our system in 2004, we tilled, and then we put the black plastic mulch on, and the black plastic mulch increased the soil temperature significantly. And by the way, we found increased total microbial biomass in the spring in Montana under black plastic mulch. Even the microbes liked it warmer, apparently. We thought we might have lower total microbial biomass in the black plastic mulch, but in fact it was higher. So we had water, and not being a microbial ecologist or microbiologist, I'm going to go on a limb and say that I think our microbes incorporated for us.
Okay. We have another question about whether you rotated the location of the crop rows and clover strips, or whether you always left the clover strips in the same location.
Good question. I'm sorry I didn't answer that. In the first field that we were in for about 12 years, we rotated every year. So that was basically our green manure, our cover crop, our rotation. When we moved to the permanent no-till row middles, we did crop rotation, but we didn't do the legume living mulch rotation. So we left the beds as permanent beds.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit more about your transplanter, the height of the beds, and the bed edge management?
Bed edge management, another good question. And I should have mentioned that as a challenge in the earlier system, in the system where we tilled every year, and of course we learned later on that every time we disturb, we make space for annual weeds. We did have weeds growing up along the bed. So we would mow, and you saw that I had really wide row middles. That's because I got lazy and learned to do that with a tractor, with my little 48-inch mower and tractor. So I made my beds wide so I could do that. But right along the bed, I can tell this person knows about black plastic, the weeds did grow up. And so what I had was a BCS sickle bar mower, and I would once a month go down the bed and use that. What I want to say about the permanent living mulch row centers is that became a non-issue, or at least it was a non-issue for the first 4 years before the grasses started growing in. We didn't have the annual weeds coming up on the side of the bed, you know how they do, and so we didn't have to do that. Okay, and the other question was about the transplanter.
And the height of the beds, yeah.
The height of the beds was, you know, depending on how much residue there was and how much bad language I had when I went through trying to manage all those residue, making the beds, and whether or not I was patient or not, we would go from about 6 to 8 inch height beds. The transplanter is a water wheel single row transplanter.
Okay. What were the yields on the crops grown using black plastic mulch versus the minimal tillage transplanted crops?
I never compared, except the last year. I never compared that. I never asked that question, except one year I did peppers, black plastic mulch, and peppers without. And the yield was, I don't have the numbers in front of me. It was lower. I don't quite remember how much lower. But what was significant is not only was the yield lower, but the yield was about 2 weeks later, which for me made a big difference selling direct at farmers market, and a huge difference in terms of whether or not I made money on red peppers or sold a lower green pepper price. So yield was lower. I don't remember how significant it was. But what really was significant that I remember is it was quite a bit later. And otherwise, basically, we did the cool season crops without black plastic mulch, and the broccoli, Brussels sprout, and cabbage yield was also quite good. And again, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but comparable or better than the other vegetable farms in our area.
Okay. What do you think about the oilseed radish being used in the row seeded the fall before? A comment is, it seems the research showed that nitrogen release is early from winter-killed radish. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I've seen some of that work. I've seen some of those. I've seen that in fields in Idaho. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And I basically, as you know, stuck with legumes. I did try a few non-legumes. I didn't ever try myself any of the brassicas. But I think that's an excellent, excellent idea. And I do want to say that another thing that another reason I think that's an excellent idea is that we noticed every year when we tilled in our brassicas that we started out with a little less weed pressure. So I believe a lot of the literature I see on allelopathic possibilities with brassicas.
Okay. This is another question about Biodesign Farm. What was the surrounding landscape within a half a mile or so of the field? Were they all conventional fields or something more favorable for insect habitat?
Excellent question. I live in I'm trying to think of a good term. I don't live near a lot of vegetable producers. There were orchards near me, but mostly I am surrounded, except for potato producers, I am surrounded by grains and cattle production. So that is an excellent question. So the pressure for certain pests, I think, is much lower where I was in Montana. Not some pests. You know, the lepidopterans moved in all on their own very well. In fact, if you go to my website, there's a video, and while I'm talking, you'll see that there are all these cabbage white moths basically swarming around me. So we had high pressure from native brassica sources around us, and from some of the things grown in the field crops, but we don't have a lot of vegetable producers within. The closest vegetable producers are within about 5 miles.
Okay. We have 2 questions asking about what alternatives you have to black plastic mulch.
Oh, yeah. I didn't talk about that mulch or much. That was the paper experiment you saw that we tried. And what we used, and I liked very, very much, I might add, well, I guess I'm just going to use what it was because it's a brand name, but EcoCover. We used EcoCover, and it basically was a paper mulch with kind of a black vegetable dye, and man, it lasted the whole season, even with sprinkler irrigation. And you saw from those tables that was our highest yield. Even better than in-row tillage. So it didn't seem to warm the soil up as much as I thought it would, but it did warm the soil up. So that was one alternative if you're going to go for a high yield. And what I'm playing with now as I get older and get to do what I want is trying to figure out this competition threshold stuff and how I can manage the ecological interrelationship such that I can push the balance more towards the crop, but still still have a vegetative management system as opposed to using the black plastic mulch. And even if yields are lower, how much labor am I saving, and hence is it still profitable? That's kind of a long answer to that question.
Okay. How wide are your living mulch strips compared to the veggie beds? Are the beds and strips permanent, or well, I think you talked about that a bit. But how wide are they?
When I first started out and I was trying to get the most production or the most plants per acre, we had beds that were let's see, I'd put down 48-inch plastic, and then so about 3 foot beds, basically a little more than 3-foot beds, and the rows in between were just a furrow. Fortunately, I don't drive very straight, and so it convinced me to make my beds even bigger, so I wasn't taking out the next bed when I was driving, and so we kept increasing, and then finally I realized that I like to sit on the tractor better than I like to push the hand mower, so I made them big enough that my 48-inch mower would go in between. And I forgot did I answer that whole question?
I think so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What compost manure application rates were you using before you put down the living mulch?
The very first year, not knowing what I could get away with, we went with about 10 tons per acre, and we dropped precipitously every year after that till the late 90s. We were just putting a little skim, and when I tried to figure it out, it looked like we were putting out about 2 tons per acre, but it was kind of hard for me. I just know that I had to drive fast to put out that little skim of compost.
Okay. You mentioned better cover crops than red clover, and you mentioned annuals that would winter kill. Do you have any particular recommendations for some better cover crop?
I do, but I also think that there's a lot of really good literature out there. In fact, there was a webinar that I watched on eOrganic on winter kill annuals, but the one that I used and would use again, except that the seed is expensive, is Berseem clover, B-E-R-S-E-E-M, Berseem clover, and I used that next to seeded lettuce because it would winter kill.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to mention that if anybody wants to watch any of the other archived webinars that we've had, and we had several on cover crops and on reduced tillage, and they can all be found at that second link that's up on your screen. And if you kind of scroll down to the bottom, it says Webinars by eOrganic, and then you can see all of the recordings of our archived webinars. We have time for a couple more questions. Let's see.
Alice, can I just add to that one more time?
Sure.
I do want to say that one of the other places that I farmed the last 2 years was on an island in British Columbia, and we used crimson clover, and I had the most wonderful experience with it that some people probably wouldn't have liked, in that it didn't winter kill. And so it died in the summer after it flowered and set seed, and so it kind of wasn't taking up a lot of space, so to speak, because it had died in July. And then when I kept watering, it reseeded itself. This was within potatoes, by the way, and it reseeded itself late enough in the season that it overwintered and covered the soil throughout the summer, or excuse me, throughout the winter. So in warmer climates where things, probably other people have tried this and already know this, but for me it was an epiphany. Duh, Helen, you can do the annual, maybe get the timing right, and you don't have to reseed it. It reseeds itself if you just let it die out on its own. So there you have it.
Okay. A question about slugs. Did you notice any slug problems, or were they not an issue?
Slugs were an issue some years, and particularly if I didn't keep the living mulch mowed. When I kept the living mulch mowed and I was not profligate with my water use, they weren't a big deal. But yeah, a couple of years they were a big deal in the red peppers.
Okay, let's see. We had a question about where you collected the data regarding the fungal and other microbial populations present in the different treatments, and I'm sure people would be interested to know where they could access some of the research that you did.
Yeah. So total microbial biomass was done by our soil scientist at the University of Montana, and we did the chloroform extraction method. I'm having a mental block on his name. He's no longer at the University of Montana, but the chloroform extraction method is a common method, and in fact, even this old farmer got to go into the lab and figure out what was going on there. So that was what we used for that because we had the researcher right here who could help us out. When I was in Colorado, we sent our samples off to be analyzed, and of course there's all kinds of labs out there that do that kind of work. And the Mycorrhizae work was done by University of Montana too. We had another a microbial ecologist who was an expert, Dr. Rillig, at the University of Montana. He still is an expert, but he's not at the University of Montana anymore. And so that's why we did that. But again, there are labs out there that will give you numbers for sure if you want to do it as a farmer. And then the question about accessing my data, I plan on, of course I planned on this last winter too, but I plan on this winter sitting down and writing it all up into farmer-friendly form and seeing if it makes sense to me, particularly in light of all the other stuff I've seen the last 2 years on other people's farms. And, of course, that will be on eOrganic sometime soon.
Wonderful. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. This is more of a bigger picture question. The commenter sees a disconnect between the trajectory and goals of this type of production system that actively promotes species diversity and the guidance coming from food safety professionals that seem to be advocating for a more sterile approach, get the critters out of the field. If you could comment on that.
Oh, boy, I could comment on that for a lot. That's an excellent question. And I hope nobody noticed that rogue dog in the broccoli field with me, yes. So that's a really big problem. And it's one of the reasons that my future directions you saw goes to veganicpermaculture.com, because I think there is a real disconnect, and I'm very, very worried about this sterility issue. So I don't have an answer except that when I talk to people that have any power, I say I think ecology is at least as important, if not more important, than food. Well, I better not say that. Food safety is really important. I have to tell you that, you know, I had my diverse system where coyotes wandered through and voles wandered through and birds did their thing, and I ate out of it, and so did all my clients, and we're all very, very healthy, and nobody ever got sick. But I know that's clearly, I'm not an expert in this area, so you just get my proselytizing.
Okay. So I think this will have to be our last question because we're running low on time here. But this is, I guess, interesting in relation to the last question. What thoughts do you have about integrating animals, for example, pigs for tillage, into the system beyond the hundreds of sheep in the first year of implementation? And how are you managing without animal manure inputs in high pH soils?
I'm going to answer that as a scientist, and then as me and what I really care about. So as a scientist, I'll say that it, except for the food safety things and except for some of my other concerns about manure, it does make sense to have animals be part of a system. I have no research on that except for my neighbor's sheep because I'm a vegan, and I am really, my new direction is to look at animal-free farming and figure out what we can do with a plant-based fertility system.
Okay. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to thank you for all your questions. And as I mentioned before, if you have additional questions, you can use the Ask an Expert system at the link on your screen. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted within the next week or so at the first link on your screen. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you so much, Helen, for coming today and for allowing people the opportunity to ask you questions. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.